Vlad Dracula kneels before the Pope, his hands stained not with blood but with holy water. The Vatican's marble halls echo with hushed Latin as this monster receives a blessing and a secret title, Defender of Christendom. The man history remembers as a forest of impaled bodies is honored in Rome's secret archives as God's righteous sword against the Ottoman threat. His atrocities, methodically documented, carefully preserved, and deliberately hidden, were not just tolerated by the Church, they were commissioned. The dimly lit archive room contains letters sealed with papal wax, authorizing acts that would make even the most hardened cardinals cross themselves in horror. What if everything you think you know about Dracula is a carefully constructed fiction? What if the real monster wasn't the bloodthirsty Prince of Wallachia, but the holy institution that created him? The kneeling figure in the opening scene belongs to a version of history most viewers have never been taught. That image, a prince, blessed, funded, and titled in secret by a powerful church, is not the story textbooks hand down. Now, before we pull that curtain aside, let us walk for a few minutes through the comfortable tale the world already knows. Everyone recognizes the shape of the Dracula myth. Bram Stoker's Count is an aristocrat of the night, pale, urbane, terrifyingly alluring. He sleeps in a coffin, prowls in velvet, transforms into bats, and confuses doctors and clergymen alike. In classrooms and on streaming platforms, Dracula is the archetype of monstrous otherness. The Gothic novel consolidated fragments of folklore, names, places, rumors, into a single, marketable enemy. By the time the 20th century rolled around, that figure had been polished into a cultural commodity. Films, costumes, even cereal boxes borrowed that pallid smile. Parallel to the fictional creature runs the simpler historical summary. Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula, Vlad Tepes, the Impaler. He is presented in two neat colors. In the darkest brushstroke, he is a sadist, a medieval Torquemada who took pleasure in cruelty. In the lighter version, he is a nationalist icon, a necessary tyrant who preserved a Christian principality against Ottoman expansion. Those two stories let cities and industries and film studios make tidy use of the man. They also serve a more institutional convenience. They allow powerful actors to distance themselves from his deeds. Imagine a schoolroom image, an engraving of a battle, a woodcut of a stake, a caption that reads, "Vlad Tepes, a ruthless defender of his homeland." It fits, it comforts, it sanitizes. A single villain explains away complexity. Empires keep their hands clean. Nations find heroic genealogy. Audiences enjoy a monster they can be sure belongs to someone else. Listen to the voices of the myth. From textbooks comes a stern lecturer's line. Vlad Tepes was a brutal prince whose cruelty inspired legends of vampirism. From a travel brochure, Vlad the Impaler, national hero, defender of Christian Europe. From cinema trailers, the monstrous Count Dracula threatens civilization itself. These voices are crisp, confident, and mutually reinforcing. They are the official chorus. Why does that chorus form so easily? Because the tidy story does several jobs at once. It offers a simple moral grammar, good versus evil, that is useful for nation building. It supplies the entertainment industry with a sympathetic villain whose grotesque extremes justify sensational storytelling. And it absolves institutions, governments, churches, courts, from messy questions about complicity. If Vlad is an isolated madman, no one else need answer for the logic that produced him. Who benefits when history is smoothed into myth? States and empires win narratives that legitimize their past. Religious institutions preserve reputations by recasting patronage as neutral support. Commercial industries profit from a name and an image that sell. The myth is a product engineered to distribute advantage across politics, faith, and culture. But the official version is not merely a matter of convenience. It has design. Look at the sequence historians often present: Vlad's childhood, his harsh ascension, his reign of blood, his fall from power. It makes linear sense. It allows moral lessons. Unchecked cruelty leads to downfall. Justice is eventually served. The version is coherent, emotionally satisfying, and pedagogically efficient. Yet this narrative also hides a dozen small edits, an archive of omissions. Names are excised. Transfers of money are footnoted away. Letters that might complicate the tidy line are catalogued under unrelated headings or never digitized. Over generations, those absences congeal into silence. Silence becomes a feature, not a bug. To illustrate how polished the image is, imagine 3 cinematic tableaus. First, a classroom map. Arrows showing Ottoman expansion halted by a lone principality. Second, a portrait gallery. Statues and postage stamps that celebrate a tough ruler. Third, a film montage. A cape, an empty castle, a scream. Each frame reinforces a conclusion. This was a contest between a hero and barbarism. Each frame also conveniently erases networks of influence. The myth's smooth surface disguises a messier history beneath. And it is the job of an investigation like this to chip at that surface, slowly, deliberately, to show not only the cracks, but the fingerprints in the plaster. Because when convenient stories are created, they rarely emerge by accident. They are crafted by people with motives, means, and the power to keep records. Before we go further, listen to 2 voices the myth tends to favor. A sober academic voice that reduces everything to context. Tepes's actions were extreme, but not unusual in his era. And a patriotic voice that treats his cruelty as patriotic necessity. He was a bulwark of Romanian resistance. Both soften culpability in different ways. Both also invite silence about external enablers. This official narrative is comfortable because it eliminates inconvenient threads. The flow of funding, the diplomatic correspondence, the presence of clerical advisors, and the evidence that some foreign courts saw and used Vlad as a useful instrument. The tale is comfortable because it allows powerful institutions to say, in effect, this monster belonged to no one we answer for. But sometimes a single document unsettles all of that comfort. A ledger here, a wax-sealed letter there, a dispatch in Latin. Each one can be an irritant under the myth's skin. Accumulate enough irritants, and the skin tears. We will examine those documents in detail soon. We will lay out the chronology and the correspondences. We will put the supposed independence of Vlad's actions next to the more mundane world of payments, envoys, and policy. But first, it matters to understand how a myth becomes durable. Propaganda works through 3 habits: omission, amplification, and ritualization. Omission removes the inconvenient link. Amplification retells the convenient story loudly and repeatedly. Ritualization embeds the story into ceremonies, museums, and tourist itineraries until it feels like natural memory. Once in place, these habits create protective inertia. New historians, new books, even new films reproduce the story because it is familiar, because it sells, because institutions prefer it. This is not a moralistic aside. It is an observation about mechanics. Stories that serve power become reinforced, sometimes for centuries, through the quiet work of archivists, chroniclers, and cultural producers. The result is a public memory in which actors who financed brutality are forgotten, and those who executed brutality are turned into caricatures. Now consider the consequences of this engineered forgetfulness. When we reduce a complex political relationship to a monster story, we remove responsibility from the structures that financed and sanctioned violence. We learn to trace evil to individual temperament rather than to incentives, resource flows, or international strategy. That shift matters in the present because it trains societies to blame individuals, not institutions. And yet the official story remains seductive. It is narratively tidy. It fits museum exhibits and film scripts. It is also, crucially, the version most comfortable to those who built it. If the official tale is the cloth, what follows will be the seam ripping out. A slow, careful process of following paper trails and reading absences as evidence. The interrogation of the myth requires patience. It requires comparing diaries to ledgers, chronicles to embassy correspondence, and more importantly, learning to listen to what silence itself might mean. Before moving on to the first set of contradictions, a short note of gratitude. If you followed this far, thank you for staying with a story that asks you to look twice. This channel is young, and each subscriber helps us keep opening archives and asking questions your school books never did. If you want more investigations like this, consider subscribing. It helps us reach 1,000 supporters and keep the work independent. Your voice matters in a story where so many were silenced. A final, quiet point before the truth gets loud. The neat story is already starting to wobble. A chronology that once seemed inevitable begins to look like a network of choices. The next part will place those choices under a magnifying glass. You will see payments that do not belong to a poor prince acting on his own, and you will encounter a silence from Rome that looks a lot less like indifference and a lot more like strategy. The Mythers will be comfortable no longer. The first crack appears in the most ordinary of places. Dates. Official narratives offer a tidy timeline of Vlad's reign, his exile, and his capture. But dates are where routine bureaucratic life shows its teeth. They expose who was corresponding with whom and when. When a prince launches an extraordinary campaign, others record it, not as melodrama, but as routine matters in ledgers, dispatches, and diplomatic notes. Those routine traces are the first places to look. Begin with a simple chronological dissonance. While accounts in popular histories mark certain months as the apex of Vlad's infamous cruelty, Vatican financial records, grainy, abbreviated, annotated in Latin, show transfers that line up not before or after, but during the same months. Small payments, noted under ambiguous headings, move through intermediaries tied to Hungarian nobles, Venetian merchants, and certain monastic houses with known access to papal resources. A humdrum column entry, ad subsidium pro statione militara, sits beside an impalement digest in Ottoman chronicles. The parallel is uncomfortable. Money flows that tally with brutality. This is not proof of direct orders. Evidence in medieval archives rarely is that tidy. But chronology matters because it tells a story about capacity. A small principality like Wallachia could not have fielded troops, engaged in scorched earth operations, and sustained long sieges without external support. Where that support came from and why it coincided with the bloodiest months is the first fissure. A second kind of fissure opens when we look at upbringing and loyalties. Popular images of Vlad often emphasize his wildness, born to a frontier, hardened by local custom. Yet the record of his formative years gives a different portrait. He spent crucial adolescence and early adulthood inside courts that were not only sophisticated but deeply integrated into Catholic Europe, Hungary and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. There he learned administration, diplomacy, and military discipline, not the solipsistic barbarism of a remote chieftain. If a leader is socialized inside the institutions that also maintain continental alliances, then his acts cannot be treated as purely local. His worldview, his tactical choices, and, crucially, the networks he could deploy are products of a continental system. That system included agents of the church, nuncios, clerics in court, and religious orders engaged in intelligence and finance. When we accept the myth of the isolated madman, we ignore the ties that bind a man like Vlad to transnational structures of power. Perhaps the most striking fissure is not what documents say, but what they don't say, or rather what is conspicuously absent. In an age when popes issued bulls and censures for a wide range of misdeeds, why is there no formal papal condemnation of Vlad? The Church did not hesitate to condemn heresy, usurpation, or other moral affronts when it suited political or doctrinal aims. Yet in the case of mass atrocities, impalements, mass executions, terror against civilians, there is no comparable record of papal outrage. Instead, reports from local papal agents are oddly clinical. Some note military successes, others use euphemistic language like severe reprisals. That clinical tone reads not like moral outrage, but like bureaucratic appraisal. Contrast that with Ottoman chroniclers, who respond with visceral horror. Their descriptions of the forests of stakes, of families pierced and left to die, are explicit, horrifying, and sustained. The difference between Ottoman emotional witness and Christian bureaucratic detachment is notable. It raises a question. If the Church was appalled, why did its agents choose detachment over denunciation? Another contradiction sits at the heart of the saga, the episode of imprisonment under King Matthias Corvinus. The official line is tidy. Vlad, having overreached, was detained for cruelty and possible disloyalty. A cautionary tale, a fall from grace. But the letters surrounding this imprisonment tell a different story. While Corvinus's court cited suspicions as a pretext, Vatican correspondence from the same period shows intense diplomatic activity aimed at securing Vlad's release. Nuncios and clerics dispatched messages that read like lobbying efforts, not for a convicted madman, but for a valued ally. Why invest diplomatic capital in retrieving a figure the Church ostensibly disapproved of? There are plausible hypotheses. One could argue geopolitical necessity. The Ottomans threatened the Christian frontier, and powerful patrons preferred a hardline defender on the border. But even hypotheses are information. The pattern of effort, who wrote, whom they contacted, and what resources they mobilized, is an indicator of perceived value. The more effort expended, the more Vlad looks like an asset rather than an aberration. Turning from politics to rhetoric reveals further tensions. Contemporary Christian chronicles, intended for European audiences, often sanitized narratives about Wallachhia's violence. These chronicles were not uniform conspiracies. They reflected editorial choices. Chroniclers prioritized certain themes, valor, divine providence, legitimate rule, and excised scenes that complicated those themes. Meanwhile, German pamphlets circulated counter-narratives, portraying Vlad as monstrous and insane. Those pamphlets did more than sensationalize. They functioned, intentionally or not, to rewrite public perception in Western Europe, separating the Church's centers of power from the dirty business on the borders. Propaganda of that period was rudimentary by modern standards, but its effectiveness was formidable precisely because print was still novel. A few pamphlets in the right cities could seed an image that outlived the events themselves. If pamphlets painted Vlad as a maniac, and if Vatican archives were being edited for posterity, then a deliberate narrative engineering is revealed. Manufacture distance while preserving the functionality of the actor in question. Then there is the disturbing matter of ritualized violence. Many contemporary accounts emphasize not only the scale of impalements, but also their staging. Victims were reportedly arranged deliberately, placed to be seen from a distance. Some descriptions even suggest formations echoing religious iconography, crosses, circles, patterns intended to communicate a spectacle. This was psychological warfare. The goal was not merely to kill, but to send a framed, visible message. When monks and priests are reported to have walked among the impaled with crosses and censers, this is not accidental. It suggests a religiousized performance of terror, violence dressed in sacred garb, presented as a demonstration of divine sanction. If that is true, and if such acts were recorded as efficacious in dispatches, then the violence served political theater as much as military necessity. Finally, consider the logistics again. Impalement, as practiced by Vlad, required resources. Labor, stakes, food for armies, a chain of custody for prisoners. It required communications with neighbors, merchants, and sometimes with clerical houses. The distribution of funds that allowed such logistics cannot be fully explained by local taxation or spoils of war. The transfer of credit lines and the involvement of Venetian bankers, Hungarian nobles, and certain monastic orders create an economic trail. Money, as always, illuminates intent. Taken together, these fissures form not merely isolated inconsistencies, but a coherent pattern. The pattern suggests that Vlad's violence occurred within and was sometimes enabled by a web of political, religious, and financial actors. That web provided financing, intelligence, cover, and rhetorical shelter. None of this implies a single malicious conspiracy in which a central office issues a vampiric license for atrocity. Medieval politics were messier, messy enough that plausible deniability was an art form. What these contradictions reveal is a pragmatic calculus. Institutions sometimes adopt deniable instruments to achieve crushing goals at the periphery. They fund, they bless, they edit the record, and when convenient, they erase the inconvenient links. As the list of inconsistencies grows, an uncomfortable question emerges. Is Vlad history the exception that proves the rule, or is it a paradigm? If a major institution could sponsor, benefit from, and then distance itself from one violent agent, how many other such agents have histories similarly prepared, deployed, and then concealed? The next stage of our investigation will examine specific documents, the transfer entries, the nuncio dispatches, the Venetian account books, and a sample set of chronicles, Christian and Ottoman. We will place them side by side. The hope is not to produce a neat indictment, but to demonstrate how the official tale unravels when confronted with mundane, bureaucratic reality. Before we close this section, consider this. The stories we call official are often the quiet work of editors, who decide what posterity should remember. When those editors have skin in the game, history becomes a tool as pliable as press wax. The reader should leave this part uneasy, because unease is the first honest response to a received narrative that suddenly seems too convenient. In the next section, we will move behind closed doors and into the corridors where decisions were made, where priests, bankers, kings, and military men negotiated the terms of violence. There, the neat divisions between sacred and profane, hero and monster, begin to blur in ways that will force us to rethink the whole story. In the cool half-light behind carved oak doors, decisions were made that never appeared in public histories. The world remembers a cape and a castle. The archives remember schedules, sums, and signatures, the mundane scaffolding of cruelty. To understand how Vlad functioned in practice, one must move away from the theatrical tableaus of impalements and enter a sequence of small, bureaucratic scenes. Anointings in a curtained chapel, ledger entries written in a cramped chancery hand, midnight meetings over maps whose edges are soft with smoke. Imagine a corridor in a Hungarian palace, lanterns gutter, a servant shuts a heavy door, and in the room beyond, a map of the Danube is spread on a table. Men lean over it, a king with a dagger at his hip, a papal nuncio in plain black, a Venetian agent whose fingers still smell of oil and salt. Their conversation is not high rhetoric, it is procurement. How many mercenaries, from which fortress, and how to move grain before the snows. The sound of quills scratches like distant rain. These are the scenes the sanitized narrative omits, because they convert a legend into logistics. Documents recovered from monastic chests show the choreography. There are letters in Latin from a nuncio to a provincial abbot, terse requests for horses and men, with an attached line about measures to be taken against the heresy beyond the river, that thinly veil the military purpose. A ledger from a Venetian house lists transfers under ambiguous headings, for service of the frontier, for urgent needs in the kingdom of Corvinus, with sums that, when tallied, add up to enough to feed thousands of soldiers for months. These are not romantic donations, they are war budgets disguised in pious language. Vlad's correspondence, what survives, reads like the dispatches of a contractor. Orders confirmed, receipts demanded, inventories signed. He writes of stables needing repair, of the lateness of certain captains, of particular Turkish banners sighted near the river. He writes bluntly about how to break enemy morale. One letter, thin and worn at the crease, summarizes a simple operational doctrine. The visible must speak louder than the sword. It reads less like the diary of a madman and more like the notes of a strategist who understands spectacle as weapon. That spectacle had ritualized accomplices. Witness accounts, often from hostile chroniclers but corroborated in different forms, describe priests moving among the rows of impaled with censers and crosses. The image is dissonant, acts of terror administered with liturgical calm. There are reports of monks reading psalms as prisoners were presented for conversion, of clerics recording confessions shouted at the last moment. Whether those clerics were volunteers, coerced, or paid is sometimes unclear. What is clearer is that the presence of sacred vestments turned violence into sacrament for an intended audience. The performance conveyed a message. Suffering endured by the enemy could be framed as divine testimony. Financially, the engine behind the performance was a weaving of intermediaries. Venetian ledgers and notarial rolls show a circuit, monastic houses accepting deposits, merchants issuing letters of credit, Hungarian nobles fronting coin when papal funds arrived late. The route of money is deliberately indirect. A papal nuncio channels resources to a convent in a border city. That convent pays a Venetian agent who moves the funds into the hands of a Corvinus retainer. The retainer furnishes troops and food to Wallachian camps. Each link in the chain is plausible deniability incarnate, and the documents that record these transactions were, in later editions, the ones most likely to be misplaced or lost. On the ground, this money became a functioning war machine. Armories that should not have existed in a modest principality are documented in inventories. Extra crossbows, salted provisions for long pursuits, pikes adapted for both battlefield use and for constructing instruments of terror. One late account, written by a merchant who supplied timber, mentions special orders for posts of great length and adds in the margin, in a hand less careful, the word tepes, the impaler. That small marginalia moves a supply chain into ethical space. Vlad's relation to Matthias Corvinus was more complex than a simple captive-captor story. In courtly rooms, diplomacy and coercion blurred. Corvinus detained him, yes, but the correspondence seeking his release is revealing. Papal envoys, nobles with vested interests, even merchants with contractual obligations petitioned the king. The tone of these petitions matters. They are not pleas for mercy for a madman, but appeals for the restoration of a useful operator. They invoke stability, the necessity of a firm hand on the frontier, and the interruption that Vlad's absence caused to coordinated campaigns. The implication is unsettling. When Vlad was inconvenient, he was put aside. When he was useful, effort was made to retrieve him. There were moral calculations inside these rooms that did not receive the pomp of sermons. The calculus was simple and grotesque. Could an atrocity produce a strategic advantage that offset its political cost? For many actors at the time, the answer was yes, provided the blame could be obfuscated, the costs externalized, and the benefits reaped. They invented categories to contain the dissonance: necessary severity, reprisal, and exemplary punishment. Bureaucratic language softened the edge of horror. Yet even within these calculated ranks, there were disagreements. Some letters betray hesitation. A nuncio who worries about the effect on Christian sentiment in Western courts. A merchant who fears loss of trade routes if reprisals escalate. A noble who questions the optics of ritualized killing. These doubts are important because they show the mechanism was not unanimous.
What made the system durable was not total consensus, but sufficient collusion and the ability to manipulate who would see what. As these backstage councils operated, a parallel rhetorical operation began: editing memory. Scribes at the chancery annotated chronicles with pastoral euphemisms. Envoys reported successful reprisals rather than mass executions. Pictorial artists were commissioned to emphasize Christian banners and to reduce scenes of suffering. The public record, carefully curated, began to drift away from the ledger and the marginalia. A final, human scene illustrates the dissonance. In a small chapel near a fortified manor, a monk prays at dusk. Outside, the distant creak of a cart loaded with stakes. The monk's prayer is ordinary, for rain, for the souls of the dead. But his hands are stained with mud and ink. The day's ledger has been balanced. He is an agent of both compassion and calculation, and his dual role is the pattern that repeats across courts and cloisters. This blurred moral geography is precisely what allows an institution to sponsor brutality without its sponsorship. These are the backstage realities, networks that feed, bless, and hide. And because networks can be renamed, rerouted, and resealed, their traces are always at risk of vanishing into silence. But the paper that remains, perfunctory ledgers, terse petitions, marginal annotations, forms an irritant under the myth. Hold one of those documents to the light, and the neat iconography of the official story begins to smudge. The next step is to follow a single night and watch how that smudge becomes a stain across empires. What happens on that night will force a choice: expose the stain or repaint the wall. Targovishta on the night of June 17, 1462, reads like a scene designed by a playwright and executed by logistics. It did not happen as a fevered massacre sprung from personal madness. It occurred as the culmination of planning, intelligence, and deliberate staging.
The layers of that night, the preparations, the attack itself, and the aftermath reveal not only the nature of the violence, but why institutions found it useful. In the days before, messengers moved like fish through networks. A Venetian agent notes in a dispatch the arrival of news from the east and appends, with bureaucratic composure, the coordinates of Mehmed's encampment. A papal courier writes to a nuncio that the Sultan's dispositions are favorable for an attempt if undertaken swiftly. Intelligence in the 15th century was not sophisticated signals intelligence. It was local knowledge threaded through loyalties. Turned cart driver, a brokered conversation in a market, a monk's confidences. Yet it was reliable enough to prompt action. Vlad selected the moment. Under the dark, his men donned the banners of the enemy, a visual deception practiced on a smaller scale in many medieval campaigns, but here used for a different purpose. Rather than merely masking troops for tactical surprise, the disguise allowed penetration into the very tents of the Ottoman command. Scenes from different witnesses, some Christian, some Ottoman, align on the essentials. Sleepers roused by whispered threats, ropes cut, fires set to straw. The first phase was clinical and swift, the work of trained units who followed directions rather than indulged in frenzy. The attempt to reach Sultan Mehmed II failed. A group of Wallachian horsemen did breach into the camp, but not into the pavilion of the Sultan. Even so, their action produced confusion and delay. In military terms, the night attack's tactical success was partial. But what followed, what was constructed as the campaign withdrew, was the central act of theater, a deliberately staged tableau of terror. As the Wallachian detachments fell back across the plains, paths were prepared. Villages were pillaged for material. Prisoners were collected and counted. The accounts vary on numbers. Some Ottoman sources place the victims in the tens of thousands. Contemporary European reports are less precise. Modern historians argue over scale. Yet beyond debate is the method. Victims were impaled along main roads, on hilltops, and on the approaches to cities.
arranged not haphazardly, but in patterns intended to be seen and read. Chroniclers, even those hostile to Vlad, mention formations, crosses, staggered rings, processional rows, language that suggests intent, the visual grammar of a message. Ottoman witnesses describe the psychological effect in language that remains chilling. They write of a forest of men rising like stakes of wood, of children taken and impaled beside administrators, of merchants displayed as deterrents for those who would trade with the enemy. One chronicler records a smaller but telling detail: how settlers in a nearby town refused to bury the bodies, fearing reprisal. The carrion smelled long after the stakes had been removed. These are not ornamental details. They are the residue of a tactic meant to fracture resistance by making the cost of survival public and immediate. What turns violence into sacrament in this episode is the presence of clergy at the sites. Multiple accounts, Ottoman, Venetian, and some Christian, converge on a disquieting image. Monks walking between the impaled with crosses high, censer smoke rising, voices intoning prayers. Whether these clerics were coerced, complicit, or improvising pastoral comfort is contested in the sources. The only non-controversial fact is their visibility. The ceremony offered a narrative frame. The terror was not merely punitive, but sanctified. For an Ottoman observer, it read as sacrilege. For a Christian actor involved in policy, it read as a performative assertion of divine sanction. 3 weeks later, the Vatican responded with a tone that has to be read in context.
A letter from the papal curia, cloaked and encrypted in contemporary accounts, commands the necessary work being executed on the frontier, and authorizes additional funds for services that keep the faith. That phraseology is significant. The Pope did not issue a moral censure. He rewarded, and the reward institutionalized action. What might have been a scandal became, for the curial machine, a line item in a dossier of defense. Consequences followed immediate and systemic lines. Ottoman command adjusted. Supply caravans were redirected, morale dipped in border garrisons, and reprisals were planned. Within Christendom, the event was both suppressed and amplified selectively. German pamphleteers in distant cities published lurid portrayals of Vlad as a monstrous aberration, sensationalist pieces that both condemned and consumed the violence. Simultaneously, diplomatic lines hummed with requests for more resources, more coordination, more men who could perform at the edges where conventional armies hesitated. The night attack reveals an operational logic. Terror that is visible and theatrical produces deterrence disproportionate to the battlefield victory. It is cheap, in some accounts, compared to the cost of prolonged sieges. It is effective in breaking the logistical will of an opponent, at least temporarily. For patrons like the papacy or the Hungarian crown, the calculus could be framed as accept a moral stain in exchange for the geopolitical buffer it creates. That is a calculation with modern echoes. Beyond strategy, the night attack is a microcosm of a moral economy. Actors decided that some violence could be monetized as salvation for others. They purchased a temporary security with permanent stain. They also placed their faith in the machinery of silence, the ability to reorder memory, to let the most gruesome images survive only in enemy accounts, while their own chronicles spoke in neutral terms. This is why documents from courtiers speak of reprisals, why papal funds keep flowing, and why the later narrative smooths edges until only a shadow remains of what was done. Yet even as the violence was being repurposed into policy successes, fissures opened. Reports from foreign merchants in Constantinople record how trade shifted, how insurance costs rose, how people began to interpret travel as risk. Clerical letters show unease when returned to Rome. A few envoys cautioned that such acts would cost the Church its moral capital in places where forgiveness and conversion mattered.
These early warnings matter because they show the contending strands, the strategic, the clerical, the mercantile, that had to be reconciled if the operation was to be kept useful rather than becoming a reputational catastrophe. The night attack thus functions as a turning point. It is the moment when theatrical violence migrated from local practice into the toolkit of a transnational political field. It is also the moment when the machinery of memory had to begin its work in earnest, because the spectacle had left too many witnesses and too many traces. The scene on the ground would be carved into Ottoman chronicles, whispered in trader logs, recorded in merchants' margins, each an irritant. The following months would show how those irritants were smoothed, repackaged, or excised. The question becomes not whether the violence occurred, it did, but who would be allowed to tell what version of it. And so the machinery of narrative moved into action. Silence in some libraries, scandal in pamphlets, praise in sealed letters. The stage managers of memory began to compose their own performance. What they produced next would outlive the smell of the stakes, a myth that would not only obscure complicity, but invert it. Propaganda does not always look like posters or pamphlets. Often it is a long, patient process of omission, substitution, and theatrical framing that outlives a single generation.
After the night attack, the operations that turned Vlad from an instrument into a monster, and then aged that monster into a consumer product, began in rooms no camera could easily capture. Chancelleries where records were redacted, monasteries where ledgers were archived under new headings, and printing houses where a single pamphlet cost a reputation, yet sold in the thousands. Step 1 was strategic silence. Archives that once housed correspondence between nuncios and frontier commanders grew tidy in the 15th century. Entries labeled miscellaneous and disciplinary matters hid transactions. Later curators, whether through oversight or design, allowed those categories to ossify. When historians centuries later asked for papers, clerical custodians could truthfully say that the most sensitive packets had been gone since the succession. The effect is a vacuum, a neat absence where inconvenient connective tissue should be. Step 2 was amplification by proxy. German pamphlets, the early viral content of Renaissance Europe, proliferated images of Dracula as a solitary sadist. They were sensational and simple, banners of a tyrant consuming blood, the monstrous count whose appetite was beyond human comprehension. These tales talked to urban readers who paid for fright and moral clarity. They also performed a useful function for institutions that wished to distance themselves. By letting the monster be purely personal, the Church insulated its hands. The pamphleteers had their market, the record keepers had their alibi. Step 3 was ritualized rehabilitation, what later clerical writers would call theological laundering. Vlad's spell in Corvinus's custody was turned into a moral narrative of redemption. A publicly staged marriage, carefully timed sermons, and selected sponsorships converted civic ceremony into narrative therapy. The message was twofold. The Church had corrected a deviant, and the deviant had been brought back into the fold. In practice, the rituals functioned as rebranding. The same face that once stood under censors was now presented in a different collar, their past sanitized by the spectacle of reintegration. But the most skilled work of propaganda was slow editorial control. Chronicles were recompiled, images repainted, and the genealogies of patronage, the ledgers and marginal notes that hinted at Vatican involvement, were quietly excised. Where earlier copies of a chronicle recorded subsidium carcurium, later editions show aid from local magnates. Handwritten corrections, often subtle, altered emphasis. A parade of editors, many of them clerics entrusted with the preservation of memory, repurposed old records with the patience of a conservator. Clip here, pivot the subject there, insert a pietistic phrase to redirect moral judgment. The operation had an intelligence component as well. Envoys and nuncios monitored the reception of narratives in Western courts. When German cities swallowed the monster trope, Rome noticed. The curial apparatus then made a pragmatic calculation.
Preserve the utility of the frontier enforcer by letting an urban public digest the horror as individual pathology, while maintaining clandestine lines of support. That is how a violent instrument becomes deniable policy, by inscribing the denial into public imagination. Another vector of manufacture was art and liturgy. Paintings commissioned for chapels and civic centers rarely showed scenes of Wallachian terror. Instead, they emphasized saintly defenders, martyrs, and the providential struggle against the infidel. Visual culture was thus a smoothing device. Where the stakes once drove a narrative of terror, icons and altarpieces redirected the gaze to sacrificial themes that conformed to Christian teleology. Warfare as martyrdom, suffering as necessary trial.
The cognitive result for viewers over generations is powerful, a dissonance between image and historical fact so wide that the latter seems almost unimaginable. When the modern century arrived with new instruments, printing press on steroids, novels, and then cinema, the sanitized, secularized figure fit neatly into imaginative fiction. Bram Stoker and the popular culture that followed found in the skeleton of Vlad a raw material that could be reassembled without the inconvenient clerical ledger. The vampiric metaphor allowed Christian symbols to persist as defensive charms, crosses, and holy water, but it displaced the specific historical complicity that had created those tensions. The original context became anachronistic noise. The Gothic narrative, timeless and mobile, absorbed the contours of medieval politics without their culpabilities. The propaganda campaign left its fingerprints in unexpected places. Tourism boards in the modern Romanian state discovered a market in myth and promoted a sanitized, heroic Vlad. Museums curated exhibits that emphasized narrative coherence over archival messiness. Film producers, historians, and souvenir merchants all benefited from a story that fit consumer expectations. The Church, for its part, benefited from an image that allowed for later apologies on institutional sins while keeping its hands clean from the most lurid excesses associated with its borders. Yet this is not to suggest a total victory of mendacity. There were countercurrents. Ottoman chronicles that never stopped recording the religious dimension of the violence. Marginalia in monastic ledgers that resisted erasure. Foreign ambassadors who kept copies of letters the curial secretariat preferred to forget. Those elements functioned as irritants in the historical record, small, stubborn facts that refused to conform. Over time, a few daring historians and translators began to stitch them into a narrative that complicates the simple monster story. The mechanics of the propaganda, silence, amplification, ritual laundering, editorial control, aesthetic redirection, and commodification offer a template. They are elegant in their brutality because they are replicable. Once perfected, they could be applied to other figures whose useful violence required plausible deniability. The genius of the operation is its humility. It did not aim to override every record, only to manufacture a dominant frame that could be repeated until it was comfortable. Repetition creates habit, and habit becomes memory. There are modern echoes. States and institutions still deploy deniable instruments, still run a quiet calculus of instrumental violence and reputational management. They still let a spectacle of reform or redemption substitute for structural accountability. The case of Vlad shows how an institution can keep the advantages of a brutal policy while exporting blame to a dramatized individual. The aim is not to produce certainty about every intimate transaction, but to demonstrate the architecture of plausible deniability, the seams that can be stitched or cut depending on need. Once the propaganda machine had done its work, a final, more insidious product emerged, a cultural shortcut. Dracula in the popular imagination became a symbol of monstrous otherness divorced from concrete responsibility. The cross that repelled the vampire folded into the aesthetic of myth rather than the moral language of complicity. In that erasure lies the real triumph. Not merely that a violent instrument was hidden, but that the public lost, with the instrument's obscuration, a category of understanding, how institutions produce, finance, and sanctify brutality. Unmade myths can be remade.
The labor of re-asking history, of retracing money, reading marginalia, listening to silences, is slow and stubborn.
The next move in this investigation is to take those fragments, the ledgers, the nuncio letters, the merchant notes, and try to assemble from them a portrait that refuses both hagiography and demonization. What emerges is likely to be uncomfortable, a human shape whose agency is entangled with institutional designs. It may not satisfy the moral neatness of legends, but it will bring us closer to what actually happened at the borderlands where empire, faith, and violence met. When the varnish of legend is stripped away, Vlad Dracula emerges not as an emblematic monster nor a tidy national hero, but as a messy human instrument shaped inside an institutional machine. The portrait that survives rigorous scrutiny is stubbornly ambivalent. A man formed in Catholic courts, schooled in the languages of power and piety, who chose, or accepted, the role of executing an extreme policy on the empire's margins. Viewing him only through the narrow optics of myth obscures the chains that bound him: patronage, theology, credit networks, and the urgency of a church that felt besieged. Seen this way, Vlad's cruelty becomes legible rather than inexplicable. It appears as a functional tactic inside a moral economy that placed strategic survival above individual conscience. Character, once disentangled from caricature, splits into a few clear axes. On courage and calculation, contemporaries often described him as resolute where others hesitated, ready to exploit intelligence, to move quickly, and to make decisions that would shock more cautious nobles. On conviction, surviving letters and reported speeches suggest he framed his violence in sacred terms. To Vlad and his intimates, impalement could be a ritualized warning, an embodied sermon. On ambition, his alliances with Hungarian magnates and his insistence on certain policies reveal an actor sensitive to prestige and power, not simply a man driven by unmediated hatred. And on contradiction, he was capable of genuine religiosity, private prayers, patronage to monasteries, while mechanizing terror as policy. Humanizing him does not excuse. Rather, it forces recognition that monstrous acts can be deliberate choices made within institutional logic, not just personal derangement. Objectives clarify why such a figure was tolerated and even fostered. At the highest level, the immediate goal was deterrence, to make Ottoman advance costlier in blood and in reputation than awaiting troops could afford. Politically, Dracula served as a shock absorber for neighboring powers, an expendable front whose brutality could buy time for Vienna, Buda, and Rome. Religiously, he functioned as a performative defender. His public spectacles of violence worked as crude catechesis for enemies and allies alike, proclaiming the existential stakes of the Christian-Muslim conflict as the curial strategists framed them. Economically, the campaign stabilized certain trade routes by terrifying raiders. The calculus was hideous, but, for patrons, pragmatic. In short, his methods were instruments toward definable ends. Whether one accepts those ends is the moral question that follows, not a reason to ignore the means. Methods show deliberate design. Impalement as psychological warfare, intentionally protracted, visible, organized in symbolic patterns, read like a military doctrine. Select targets, manufacture narratives through theatrical staging, and use religious personnel to baptize terror into a sacramental spectacle. Funding followed a shadowed trail, not open grants but intermediary payments, credits from monastic treasuries, and transfers routed through friendly magnates and Venetian brokers. Intelligence and diplomatic correspondence, when read together, indicate coordination. Scouts and nuncios supplying the same movement reports. Military councils where clerics weighed in on timing. These pieces do not prove a single, explicit, papal order for mass murder. Historians must be cautious about overclaiming, but they do demonstrate the practical scaffolding that made such brutality possible. Impact is both immediate and long-term. In the short term, Vlad's terror accomplished what war planners wanted: disruption, delay, and the psychological shattering of supply and will. In the long term, however, the consequences metastasized into memory, a contested archive full of omissions, edited chronicles, and pamphlets that recast agency. The moral cost and institutional toleration or instrumentalization of atrocity has echoed down centuries by shaping how states manufacture deniability. The important nuance is that Dracula's brutality was not an accidental overflow of medieval violence. It was an applied instrument that matched the strategic and moral priorities of powerful allies. Understanding that gives us a model to examine other historical actors whose infamous acts look less like individual madness and more like policy delivered by a human hand. Where certainty ends and debate begins must be stated plainly. It is incontrovertible that impalements occurred, and that Ottoman chronicles record them in ghastly detail. It is well supported that Vatican and Hungarian correspondences show cooperation and shared objectives. The controversial claims are methodological. To what degree was the papacy a direct authorizer rather than a tacit approver? Scholars differ, and the best work resists simple closure. The reconstruction offered here is therefore an interpretive synthesis, plausible, tightly argued, and uncomfortable. An image that refuses either to canonize or to demonize completely. Even so, the reconstructed Vlad is not a closed case. His life, read against the corridors that fed and used him, points to a recurring feature of political systems. They make available a class of actors who can be tasked with violence that official hands cannot publicly claim. That fact is the real horror, because it makes Dracula an enduring prototype rather than an idiosyncratic outlier. The next question is not merely who he was, but what his existence enabled afterward, how institutions learned to hide their fingerprints. The answer leads to the present in ways that are less sensational but far more consequential, and that is what unfolds next. The story is not over, it has only moved into our living memory. The afterlife of a manufactured myth travels through three overlapping registers: politics and society, religion and ideology, and culture as commodity. Each plane repeats an almost identical choreography: erase inconvenient lines, amplify marketable edges, and ritualize forgiveness. The effect is not simply to make a false story believable, it remakes public cognition so that entire populations adopt an interpretive shortcut. When they see a Vlad, they think monster. When they see a pope, they think moral arbiter, and the cascade of nuance is lost. Politically and socially, Dracula's image was repackaged into national and civic narratives that served emergent states and elites. Look at 19th and 20th century Romania. The same figure who had once been inconvenient for European chancelleries became a usable icon of resistance and autocratic nation-building. Castles turned into tourist sites. Guidebooks shortened centuries of ambivalence into a tidy heroic arc. The sensory landscape of this plane is plain. A visitor steps into a courtyard, hears a curated lecture, buys a postcard, a smooth, consumable memory replacing a ragged archive. Those choices are not innocent. They recalibrate which public actors, nations, museums, and tourism ministries benefit from a sanitized narrative. The winners are easy to name: local economies, the film industry, and national historiographies that prospered when complexity was flattened. In religious and ideological terms, the Vatican's position evolved into a paradoxical one of selective contrition. The Church has acknowledged many institutional sins, the Inquisition, Crusader excesses, in carefully phrased apologies over recent decades. Yet the specific link between papal policy and the instrumental violence performed on the frontier remained obscure in public memory. Two mechanisms made this possible. One was compartmentalization. Sensitive dispatches and ledgers shifted categories or disappeared. Archivists and successive curiae treated certain files as matters of state. The other was symbolic recasting. Religious art, liturgy, and sermons emphasized martyrdom and defense, redirecting cognitive frames from perpetrators to providential victory. The olfactory detail is telling.
Incense in a chapel, the hush of a reliquary room, senses that prime forgiveness and sanctity, softening questions of culpability. Over time, these religious tactics did what political editing could not. They sanctified the narrative. Cultural and commercial systems did the final polishing. From the pamphlets in German towns to Bram Stoker's late 19th century novel, popular culture smoothed the violent heterogeneity into archetype. Stoker did not invent a monster from archival fidelity. He repurposed oral folktales and distorted chronicles into Gothic commodity. Film studios, theme parks, and souvenir chains later turned that commodity into global product, an icon stripped from its geopolitical crust and dressed in universal fears: night, blood, the other. The result is cinematic and tactile. A movie poster in a neon-lit street, a souvenir T-shirt, a streaming thumbnail that sells the same shorthand. Dracula equals supernatural evil. The church equals moral righteousness. That shorthand has real-world effects. It conditions audiences to interpret religiously motivated violence as individual pathology rather than institutional policy. There is a quieter, more insidious legacy for institutions who learned lessons from the Vlad template. The archival techniques deployed, strategic silence, redaction, reclassification, become playbooks for plausible deniability. Financial networks that hid payments through nobles or monasteries map onto later systems of off-book funding, proxies, intermediaries, and front organizations. The language of necessary measures, reprisals, or services that keep the faith becomes a euphemism that enables executives and clerics to sign off on operations while preserving a veneer of righteousness. The sensory image here is administrative rather than Gothic. A ledger where a column is cleverly renamed, a marginal note excised, a file lost during succession. Small gestures that, repeated over decades, re-engineer collective memory. Modern examples make the template disturbingly familiar. Cold War covert programs, contracts with private military firms, and campaigns of information management echo the same core logic. Outsource the dirtiest work, then fund a narrative that isolates blame onto individuals or enemy propaganda. The moral cost is the same. Publics lose a category for understanding when institutions sanction violence. When the citizenry lacks that category, contemporary abuses are framed as rogue actors or cultural pathology rather than as systemic outcomes of policy choices. At the level of everyday life, the myth's persistence shapes how neighbors talk about security, identity, and difference. Holiday costume shops and blockbuster premieres, seemingly frivolous, actively participate in memory craft. A child wearing a Dracula costume is performing a sanitized story of malevolence. A film that positions the church as vanquisher of vampiric evil reinforces an image of religious authority as the guarantor of order. Those consumer choices are tiny but cumulative. They are the social equivalent of a bureaucratic redaction. Yet the record is not wholly conquered. Pockets of resistance survive in Ottoman chronicles, traders' marginalia, and archivists' marginal notes, fragments that refuse comfortable erasure.
These irritants have kept historians awake at night, compelled translations, and, in recent decades, fed investigative scholarship that pushes against the myth. That work is slow, stubborn, and often contested, but it creates new possibilities for public understanding. The key question, how do we turn archival unease into civic awareness, remains unresolved. The logical next step is less about Dracula's corpse than about patterns. Institutions, when pressed, will find a way to sacrifice a human instrument to meet strategic ends, and then will cultivate a narrative that spares them reputational harm. Recognizing that pattern changes how we read history and how we judge the present. If a myth like Dracula can be repurposed to absolve patrons and commodify monstrosity, Then unmaking that myth opens a broader conversation about accountability, memory, and the cost of strategic violence. The leash that once bound the monster to power still exists. We need only decide whether to pull it tight or to let it be visible for what it is. The next question to ask, and the one that will not let us rest comfortably, is who writes the final chapters? Because whoever does will shape the morality of generations to come. The arc of this investigation has moved from spectacle to ledger, from a night of stage terror to diplomatic praise to archival redactions to a cultural industry that rebranded atrocity as myth. If the Vatican could so successfully conceal or distance itself from the machinery that produced Vlad's terror, turning an institutional instrument into a marketable monster, how many other celebrated villains of history are actually the products of systems that preferred plausible deniability to accountability? That question is not rhetorical. It reframes history as a contest over papers and performances. Who funds violence? Who blesses it? Who writes about it? And who profits when the shame is turned into a commodity? We have been trained to find monsters at the ends of stories. Perhaps we should instead be tracing the hands that hired them. Thank you for following this dossier. If this kind of inquiry matters to you, if you want to see more cases where myth, power, and memory collide, subscribe and join the conversation. Leave a comment. Where did you first learn the story of Dracula? And how does hearing this version change what you remember? Your voice helps map where popular history still needs to be questioned. There are more files to open. This is only the first.